The Summa Perfectionis Magesterii, Part 1. A short essay by Bruce Mills, otherwise known as the Obligate Pedestrian. The Summa Perfectionis Magesterii is a book published around 1310. The authorship is ambiguous, but William Newman has argued strongly that it must have been Paul of Taranto. Paul was a 13th century Franciscan alchemist from southern Italy, Taranto. Paul is known for the book Theorica et Practica, which covers, among other things, the debate over nature versus technology. During the 13th century, there was a debate over whether art could at best imitate nature or whether it could improve on it. This process of improvement was often referred to as perfection, with some bravado but no mystical intention. I would translate Summa Perfectionis Magesterii into modern English as something like overview of the best technology. The word magisterii meant something like practical work completed. While there is perhaps some more nuances to the word, these give the wrong impression of the intention outside the context of the then ambient culture. Yes, Paul thought of himself as doing the great work, but ultimately no more or less than people working on quantum mechanics today may see themselves as probing the ultimate secrets of the universe. A good part of the debate at the time over whether transmutation of metals was possible was tied up with the claim that nature could do things that humans with their technology could never do. There was no sound theoretical principle to suggest that transmutation, defined as manufacture of specifically the 7 magic metals lead, tin, zinc, silver, gold, iron and copper, was not possible. And it certainly turned out to be possible, if impractical, in the modern terms of nuclear reactions. It also came out of an erroneous attribution of an anti-technology work by Avicenna to Aristotle, being the last few chapters of Meteorologia, sometimes published since under Avicenna's name as Liber de Congelazione, but also under Aristotle's name as Liber de Mineralibus. The Summa Perfectionis had a great influence on later work on alchemy, in particular through the works of Albertus Magnus, Arnold of Villanova and Raymond Lull, who read and used material from Summa Perfectionis. I will work from the translation to English given by Newman. One thing that is missing from textbooks of 20th and 21st centuries is any discussion of the practical philosophy of science. What are we trying to achieve? What has been done before? How do we justify the results, and what is the basic method? In short, any real discussion of what is science and engineering. Rather, 21st century textbooks tend to leap into an abstract theory that is presented as being ontologically valid, albeit not immediately observable. A good example is the atomic theory assumed in textbooks on chemistry. While the start of Summa Perfectionis Magesterii can seem a bit preachy, and it can clash with 21st century sensibilities, the start of the book is very much a defense or literary apology for the art of alchemy itself. Contextually, this is something like an advertisement, or at least an appeal from the writer as to why the reader should give the writer credence. In a typical 21st century textbook, it is assumed the reader has no choice. This causes some clash with the popular perception of science today. As for many decades, science has assumed that it will be given preferential treatment, so it does not have to justify itself. Paul of Taranto could not assume that in the context of medieval intellectual society. Here begins my digested version. Section 1. Introduction. We collect here much of the ancient knowledge and make up for the deficiencies of our discussion. This work will cover the whole of the science of alchemy. If you work according to the information in this book, then God will grant you success in your endeavours, but if you do not follow the principles honestly, then you will not succeed. If you know the theory of minerals and their generation in nature, then you are well placed to understand the technology. Technology cannot duplicate exactly what nature does, but rather achieves the same end by its own means. Many practitioners make the mistake of trying to duplicate exactly the process of nature. Section 2. Overview of the whole process. We'll cover the things that will stop you from learning this practice. We will counter arguments by those who say this technology cannot ever work. We will then cover elements of the principles of nature, and finally cover the elements of the technology that are to achieve the same end as the process of nature. Section 3. Impediments to learning the science. The impediments are natural inability, lack of funds, lack of time, lack of effort, infirmity of mind or body, and lack of intellectual honesty. If you are blind or have maimed limbs or hands, you will find it hard to complete this study. It requires you to gain experience with observing and controlling equipment and materials in the laboratory. If you are too weak, old, or diseased, you will have problems. You must be able to follow natural reasoning, to follow what you experience in the laboratory and not be misled by preconceptions. You must be able to study and to follow and accept reasoned arguments. You must not follow your own fantasy, but subject everything to a reality check. However, you must have imagination enough to be able to work out viable explanations. Some people who claim this science does not work are looking for too much in it, magic or immediate wealth. You will need to have time and money to indulge in this pursuit. Many people who are otherwise quite able can fail because they run out of these resources, and you must not have something else that is distracting you. You must focus and persist, not jump from one topic to another. Also, while you have to learn from the laboratory, you also must be willing to learn from books. You cannot work it all out yourself. You must spend time reading learned books. Someone who makes a mistake in the laboratory is more likely to find the error and correct it if they have the background in book learning. If you're not cautious with your supplies of expensive metals, then don't blame me if you mess up and cannot finish your work. Use caution. Some people fail because they, on getting partway through and thinking to get a fast conclusion, throw all their money into alchemy and destroy their wealth. Rather, you should pause and make sure that your worldly situation is safe. If you don't do this, your life could end in grief. End of summary. That last admonition, to care about your worldly situation rather than becoming obsessive and just chucking everything into the pot in the hope of pulling a rabbit out of it, is good advice. The discovery of phosphorus by Henning Brand destroyed his life in this way, and in the end he was not the person to profit from the discovery. Admittedly, this kind of advice is not the sort of thing that one finds in 21st century textbooks. However, it is very good advice to people who do such things today to try to square the circle or to correct general relativity to fit with their own presuppositions and armchair fantasies. Perhaps some advice to this end could be added to popular science books. Here continues my digested version. Section 7. Criticism of alchemy. Some people say that there is no viable science of materials. Given a material found in nature, we do not know what are the exact proportions and disposition of the elements in it, and so we could not possibly create it ourselves. We cannot know how nature does it because it happens deep underground. There is an infinite variety of subtle effects in nature that we could never hope to understand or emulate. Anyway, if it was possible, why has it not been completed by now? Why cannot alchemy construct all minerals in an afternoon? Further, the philosophers have over thousands of years not produced the one definite theory of alchemy. They disagree with each other. End of summary. The objections given here by opponents of alchemy appear to be very much of the same mind as the opponents of science in general in the 21st century. The world is too complicated. We could never understand it. Why don't scientists agree with each other? They can keep changing their minds and look at all the problems that science has not solved. As well, there are objections specifically to evolution theory stating that species are immutable and no animal can be transformed into any other kind of animal. The opponents of alchemy in the 1300s stated that minerals were different kinds and that no method to change one into the other could work. Start of summary. Nature takes thousands of years to create the 7 metals in the earth. If you want to make this happen over thousands of hours instead, you would need to raise the heat, and that would not create the same metal, but only an inferior dried approximation, a fraud. And as for improving on nature, perfection is given by the celestial powers, not by humans. It happens outside the action of any engineering process. If it is said that the position of the stars at the time the process is conducted would provide perfection, then which position exactly? There is an indefinite number of positions that would have an indefinite number of effects. Impossible to understand and control. End of summary. Some people in the 21st century claim that we know that alchemy of the 13th century was always a pseudoscience because there were contemporary critics who said that alchemy was a combination of fraud and self-deception. The immediate problem is that these were opponents of alchemy and as such cannot be necessarily trusted to be objective about what alchemy was or did. But also the problem is that the objection of alchemy were actually objections to everything that in the 21st century is seen as science and engineering. The idea that one cannot ever understand nature because it is far too complicated and subtle, and that trying to improve on it is pure fantasy. Nature is always best. Such critiques of 21st century science exist in the 21st century. On the more complicated point, though, is the roping in of astrology into this mixture. One idea of alchemists was that perhaps by conducting a chemical reaction at the same time as certain celestial events, lunar and solar eclipses were showy favourites, but in practical alchemy it would have included many details of the disposition of the stars. In the 21st century, this would be considered to be as irrelevant as numerology on the name of the chemists. However, the objection at the time was not that no such influence could occur, but rather that an influence would be too subtle to be understood or controlled. The response of Pseudo Geber to the criticisms of alchemy were rather similar to the response of 21st century scientists to criticisms of their respective specialties, to say those things that you say we cannot do, we are doing. Here are some examples. Here are the explanations and the practical results. Start of summary. Section 8, response to criticism. The primary materials that nature uses are very stable. They are sulfur and mercury, and they are very difficult to break apart into earth, water, air, and fire. This means that if we subject them to greater heat than in nature, we do not destroy them at all. Their human nature is deep and tough and will not allow them to dry out. While nature does take a long time to create minerals, and in that process will drive off the volatile elements that are unwanted, and we cannot hope to duplicate this process, also we do not try. We follow the principles of nature, but we use different means and methods. The critics are correct that we do not understand all the details of how nature creates minerals. And this is why instead of trying to duplicate the complicated method of nature, we find a simpler process that we can understand. Some people say that they have tried this and failed and so it is not possible, but the failure of one person does not mean it is impossible. Simpler methods have been found to create some minerals. This gives us a sign that perhaps much more is possible. Some people look at how easy it is to separate the parts of animal flesh, such as water and oil, from the meat, and then say that boiling a rock does nothing. But while minerals are a lot tougher than animals, this does not mean that they cannot be decomposed. Some people say we cannot perfect animals, so how can we perfect minerals? But animals have a soul or quintessence from the prime mover, and we don't understand that. That is true, but perfection of minerals is only in the proportion of the components. Also, minerals start out less perfect than animals, so this gives us more room to improve. Some people say that in animals, species is not transmuted into species, and so in minerals this cannot happen either. But we know that a worm can turn into a fly, which is an entirely different kind of animal, so we may still do this with minerals. End of summary. I need to drop out of summarizing what Pseudo Geber is saying here because I'm trying to give a context and show similarities between medieval thinking and 21st century thinking. Some people in the 21st century complain about the use of human body as a model of the cosmos or of chemistry. The idea, however, is not as silly as it can be made to sound. If you are trying to understand something complicated, it might help if you can find analogies to something else that is also complicated, but it is more familiar. In particular, the human digestion system was often used as a model of a chemical reaction. You put material in, it is digested and transmuted into body parts, and the unwanted material is rejected. Since a number of reactions of interest involved heat and acidity, the idea of a chemical reactor being a digester was not unreasonable. In the 21st century, it would often be considered unreasonable to talk about minerals as growing or evolving. However, a lot of this is nuances of the words. A crystal in the right kind of chemical environment will indeed grow and even evolve in the general sense of the word. A bone, under the process of fossilization, evolves into a rock. But there is something more subtle as well. Over the centuries, there was an ongoing argument over vitalism in various forms. Is there a vital force that exists in plants and animals that does not exist in rocks and metals? The orthodox conclusion in the 21st century is that there is not. Animals are just very complicated chemical reactions. There is no absolute distinction, only a quantitative distinction in terms of the complexity of the chemical process. So the objection that minerals are not like living things is actually not compatible with the 21st century view. It is a throwback to the concept of vitalism that many in the 21st century would say was an ignorant view from the past. Crystal growth can be quite complicated, and some 21st century theories of abiogenesis include crystals as an intermediate step. The idea of evolution has been around for a long time, but through most of its history it was considered to be driven by fundamental creative forces that cause species to become more sophisticated over time, hence the idea that a cat might evolve into a tiger, rather like a Pokemon. And speaking of that kind of evolution, clearly the transmutation of a caterpillar into a butterfly is an example that can be observed again and again. Much of the early ideas in biology was about Platonic idealism, that rabbits exist because rabbit is a favoured form that tends to come into existence in nature, while in the 21st century it is believed that the form of the rabbit is incidental and contingent. The idea of favoured forms is not entirely unhinged. For example, atoms, hydrogen, helium, lithium, etc. exist because they are indeed favoured or stable forms that matter tends to turn into naturally with a high probability. The concept itself is not wrong or inapplicable. The argument here is about the scope of the principle. There is a lot of context, and a full discussion would be a book. But the core issue is that one objection to manufacture of gold from other minerals was that gold is a preferred form. It is a kind of species of mineral and different from lead, just as goat is a kind of animal and does not transmute into sheep. The response to this criticism is that a caterpillar transmutes into a butterfly, which is surely a very different kind of creature. Within the context of this argument, this is an entirely valid response. If one says, but it is the nature of the caterpillar to change into a butterfly under the right conditions, Pseudo Geber could respond by saying that perhaps it is the nature of lead to change into the gold under the right conditions. We just need to learn what those conditions are. If someone then says that the conditions are not ones we can duplicate, Pseudo Geber could validly say that it is worth a try to see whether some simple conditions that we can provide are sufficient, even if they are not the conditions that nature uses. As a curious example, Pseudo Geber says that if we want maggots, we cannot generate them directly, but we can put meat out to rot and so get them that way. And we can arrange the conditions so that that rotting occurs more rapidly or in a manner that we desire. In the next section, keep in mind that both the alchemists and their opponents accepted the principle that the position of the stars might be required for chemical reactions to work correctly. This idea is not entirely out of all consideration. Radiation can affect reactions, and the position of the sun affects the ambient radiation. In practice, in the 21st century, the influence of these things is considered minor and artificially duplicable. But the idea that it might have an impact is not irrational in and of itself. Start of summary. Section 10, Astrology. It is true that position of the stars might affect the generation of minerals. However, the vast majority of configurations appear every day, or failing that, every year. It is not necessarily the case that the generation of minerals involves transient brief configurations. Not only that, but if we wish to create maggots from meat, we do not wait for the position of the stars, but make sure the disposition of heat and humidity are right. Some people say it is easier to destroy than to create, and it is very near impossible to destroy gold, so all the harder it must be to create it. Perhaps this is true, but it does not mean that it is impossible to do so. Section 11, General Remarks. There are many objections made to the art of alchemy. However, most of these are about the difficulty of finding the appropriate principles to use to manufacture minerals. In this book we will discuss those principles that have been found so far to confirm that this science and engineering is viable. Keep in mind that while there are some good principles in alchemy, there are also a rather large number of bad writers who do not properly understand and discuss the principles. Do not judge alchemy by the writings of these people. Also, keep in mind that there are different schools regarding the philosopher's stone specifically, and they disagree with each other. Some say that sal ammoniac is the key, and others say that lead is, or different types of salts. Some insist on using vegetable matter. Usually both sides are devoid of reason. End of summary. Pseudo Geber thus ends this discussion on a rather negative comment about the number of alchemists who give bad explanations, hide their secrets, and don't check the ideas against practical experiments. An attack is also made on the multitude of ideas about how to create the philosopher's stone, which is generally said to be a red powder that, when thrown into molten lead, will convert it into gold. The Summa Perfectionis Magesterii is not a book about how to make the philosopher's stone. Pseudo Geber appears to believe it is possible to transmute lead into gold, but does not claim to know the details of how to do it. Rather, like fusion power in the early 21st century, the book is about the practicalities and justification for alchemy as a whole, and then about the details of the equipment and the furnaces and working in a laboratory, as well as about various specific reactions and processes. The next part of the defense of alchemy by Pseudo Geber discusses specifically aspects of the sulfur-mercury theory of metallurgy, criticisms of the more specific theories rather than the broader idea of alchemy, and this will be discussed in another essay.